Okay, well, how are you? I'm Dr. Luis Martinez, and I am lecturer in global health. For those who are not studying here at the University of Manchester, welcome to the University of Manchester and welcome to the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. Thank you all for being here, and also thank you for all the people that is watching online. It's a real pleasure to welcome Kate Kelland to the university, and also with this conversation, which is Disease X, moving from global failure to global readiness. Before we begin, I just want to share with you some notes. This is a hybrid event, so we have people here, we have people online, and after Kate's presentation, we will have time to run some questions here. So we will accept some questions here from the room and also questions online. For those watching this online, if you want to share your ideas or ask some questions, you just have to put them in the comment section and we will be happy to read them. Also, after the session, we invite you to join us for drinks and snacks at the Helen Wilkinson Commons at the entrance. So this will be an informal conversation, but that would be a really good opportunity to do some networking and also have a conversation with Kate. And now to begin with the conversation, let me say just a few words about the topic. And the reason why this topic matters. You remember COVID. Right? So COVID-19 made one thing very clear. The world was not ready. There had been many warning signs, but when a new virus began to spread, the world was too slow to respond. So this event asks a simple question, a simple but important question, which is, what needs to change before the next pandemic? And by next pandemic, we are referring to disease X, which COVID-19 was a disease. Right? So in this conversation, Kate will help us to think about the three important things: what the failure happened, what almost worked, and how the world could do better next time. That's the purpose of the book. That is the purpose of this conversation. And to take us to this story, we are really pleased to welcome Kate Kelland to the University of Manchester.
Thank you.
Before just starting, I would like to introduce our guest. Kate is a really good friend, and she's an author and a former health and science reporter who won several journalism awards during her career. Today, she is the chief scientific writer at the Coalition for Epidemics, Preparedness, Innovations, also known as CEPI. Before joining CEPI, she spent 27 years at Reuters reporting on global health, science, and major disease outbreaks. She is the author of the book Disease X, the 100 Days Mission to End Pandemics, which came out in 2023. The book takes readers inside the global work to prepare for the new outbreaks and stop them before they become bigger crises. Brings together vaccine science, public health, and the political choices behind pandemic performance. Okay, thank you very much for visiting us today and for sharing all the experience that you have on this, the fellowships.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that I brought a little bit of sunshine with me up from Oxfordshire. I am delighted to be here, and thank you very, very much. Very grateful for the invitation to talk about infectious diseases. I'm going to be talking about old ones and new ones, and known ones and unknown ones. Unknown ones that are, of course, we refer to as disease X. And I'm going to be talking about how we shift the world from this global failure to global readiness so that we can be resilient and face the next pandemic threat in a more prepared and effective way. So I'm Kate Kelland. I'm the author of this book, Disease X, the 100 Days Mission to End Pandemics. And as Louise said, I'm also a former journalist, so writing is in my blood. I was an international correspondent for Reuters news agency for 27 years, and For about the last 15 of those, my focus was global health and science coverage. So as you can imagine, as the health and science correspondent, I covered a lot of outbreaks of disease. I wrote a lot about the world, the way the world deals with them. My first big story, in fact, when I became a global health correspondent, I moved from being a political correspondent to a global health correspondent. And my first big story was the H1N1 swine flu pandemic in 2009. And after that, over the years, I covered multiple more outbreaks and epidemics. Some of them were totally new diseases, real novel viruses, like in 2012, when a novel coronavirus emerged that was later called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. And some of them were new names, but only new to some people, like when Ebola spread so widely in West Africa in 2014 and then across the world. And other diseases and outbreaks were just really, really persistent and ever present. HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, polio, cholera. So when I first began writing stories about this mysterious new virus that was causing clusters of pneumonia-like illness in Wuhan in China, I was quickly one of the very busiest correspondents in the newsroom. And it wasn't long before my life became completely overrun by and consumed by this enormous, overwhelming, unending, breaking and developing news story. A fast-moving, deadly pandemic was happening right now in front of our eyes. And it seemed to me that the world was in a pretty poor state to be able to respond to it. And it also seemed to me, given the perspective that I had at that time of a decade or so or more of covering global health, that we could or should have been able to see this coming. But we didn't. And I think back to those early days, those first few days and weeks of or even months of the pandemic. It's quite sobering to remember how clueless and naive we were when COVID first emerged. To remember for how long we carried on thinking it was just something that was happening somewhere else. It was happening in China, over there, that it was someone else's problem. Or at worst, it would be a regional problem, and it wouldn't affect the rest of the world. And then also to remember and see how faltering our moves were when it began to become clear that COVID was indeed a global problem. When political leaders floated bizarre quick fix ideas, like Donald Trump suggesting that we drink bleach or shine ultraviolet light inside our bodies. And others downplayed the crisis, carried on doing so. Boris Johnson going around shaking people's hands in hospitals in March 2020, and saying that we should let the bodies pile high because that was better than having some kind of economic lockdown. It's definitely sobering and I think important to remember that those things happened in the early days of COVID pandemic. So in August 2021, I joined the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. And in the book, I call CEPI the Pandemic Prevention People. CEPI is a research-focused, non-profit global health coalition, which is working to develop vaccines against emerging diseases. We do that because we're also trying to identify innovative ways to respond swiftly to, and ideally to neutralise, as yet unknown epidemic and pandemic threats. CEPI was set up in 2017 as a really tiny organisation, just like 50 people. And now it's still quite small, a few hundred, but it's having a very big influence on global pandemic preparedness. When SARS-CoV-2, the COVID virus, first emerged in 2019 in China, CEPI moved really fast to put in seed funding to develop a portfolio of COVID vaccines, including the first funding that went into the Moderna vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and also a shot that was developed by Novavax. We also worked with the WHO to establish COVAX, which many of you will know was the first ever global vaccine sharing facility. So my book, Disease X, charts some of what CEPI and its partners did in response to the pandemic, but more than that, it sets out a roadmap for what we can learn and how we can do better the next time a viral threat like this emerges. As I'm sure you already know, Disease X is the name given by scientists and by the World Health Organization to an unknown pathogen that will emerge in the future and could cause a serious international epidemic or pandemic. And another one will emerge. There is no doubt about that. We often heard during COVID, and it used to make me quite cross, people would say this is a once in a lifetime event, a once in a century event even. But sadly, that is very far from the truth. COVID-19 was the latest in an increasingly regular series of previously unknown viral pathogens to have emerged in recent years. In fact, it's the 7th infectious disease to have caused an epidemic or pandemic in this century alone. And we're about a quarter of the way through that century. We had SARS-1 in 2003, H1N1 in 2009, MERS in 2012, Ebola in 2014, Zika in 2015, COVID-19 in 2019-2020. That was the big one. But if you think about it, since then we've had Marburg, Ebola, chikungunya, various outbreaks all over the world of these emerging and some of them novel diseases. Every single one of those infectious disease epidemics and pandemics has happened since the year 2002, which was when my son was born. And he's 23 years old, so they are very, very far from a once in a lifetime event. And there's no chance that the viral world, is going to just stop there. In fact, climate change, environmental change, globalization, deforestation, the encroachment of a growing human population into the habitats of wild animals, all of these factors mean that the viral world is far more likely to speed up when it comes to chucking up new threats than to slow down or to stop. Another disease X is out there, perhaps many, many more of them. It's only a question of time before the viruses that will cause these novel disease outbreaks begin to make their way across the animal to human frontier. I wouldn't want you to think, though, that Disease X, the book, is just a scare story. I do admit, though, that in writing it, and in calling it Disease X, which is obviously a slightly alarmist headline, I did want people to feel a little bit scared. I wanted, and I still want, to raise the alarm, to warn people against giving in to this great desire that so many of us have to put the world of pandemics and infectious diseases and lockdowns and vaccines and masks and all of those things. We want to put that behind us. This desire to make the current years or the next few years about something other than viral threats and disease outbreaks. We want to move on. But I do want to dissuade people from moving on, because moving on almost always comes with people starting to forgetting the pain and the fear and the isolation that infectious diseases bring with them. to forget that children weren't able to go to school, to meet their friends, to make new ones, except over Zoom. And to forget that so many people, millions of people, died before their time, and that families were torn apart, and thousands of old people died alone and heartbroken in care homes. Because if we start to forget that pain, we also risk forgetting how important it is to do everything in our power to reduce the risk of this happening again. I want to dissuade people from doing that. I want to persuade people like all of you for a start, to stay on the alert, to be aware, and yes, be a little bit scared, at least scared enough to keep pushing for better preparedness and better vigilance. The COVID pandemic has shown us how quickly complex infectious disease emergencies can evolve into global security crises. It's also adding and has added to a pattern of ever more frequent and ever larger and ever more far-reaching outbreaks and epidemics over the last 4 or 5 decades. The pattern is telling us something we should be aware of and alarmed by. It's emerging across multiple different families of viruses. And we've seen it in coronaviruses, where we had SARS, MERS, and COVID. All of them were novel coronaviruses. We've seen it with filoviruses, paramyxoviruses, orthopoxviruses, and many more. And what we see and what is happening, and what shows in this pattern, is that the range of known threats of diseases like Ebola and Nipah and chikungunya and Zika and dengue, it's expanding. Outbreaks are becoming larger and new pathogens are also continuing to emerge. Given this ever increasing likelihood of novel diseases emerging and the evidence of this century alone, I truly think that staying vigilant and slightly alarmed is actually the only plausible way for the world to move on. But also in writing this book, I wanted to tell people that it doesn't have to be this way. The scary bit of the book's title, is followed by the subtitle, The 100 Days Mission to End Pandemics. And the book really is about hope, not fear. In my own small way, I'm trying to inspire people to take up and to keep up the fight, not to throw up their hands in despair and say there's nothing we can do. This is a once in a lifetime, once in a century event, we can't do anything. Outbreaks and epidemics are inevitable, yes, but pandemics are a choice. Disease X sets out a strategy to rapidly control and neutralize potentially dangerous emerging viruses before they become deadly pandemics. And crucially, it is a strategy that doesn't depend on knowing everything. It doesn't depend on knowing exactly what's coming. Because when a new disease emerges or a new outbreak begins, the people at its epicenter, those first few people who fall sick, and the first few healthcare workers or public health officials who are presented with them, they are in a fog. They are in the dark about so many things. They don't know whether a new disease is going to turn out to be deadly and dangerous or just mild. They don't know whether it may spread quickly or fizzle out. There are so many unknowns, but that doesn't mean we can't prepare. And it certainly doesn't mean that we shouldn't prepare. So the Readiness Plan, the 100 Days Mission, is one that depends on dedicated preparation and investment of time and effort and resources. And it's one that depends on improving our ability to adapt swiftly to whatever might come at us next. It is focused on making the world at the same time more alert, more resilient, and more agile in the face of infectious disease threats, so that we don't have to know exactly what's coming to be able to deal with it and to be able to prepare for it. When I'm not writing about viruses and infectious disease threats, I do a lot of running and swimming and cycling. And sometimes I do all three together in competitive triathlon racing. So it may not be surprising that I like to draw analogies between being well prepared to beat pandemics and being well prepared to finish an ultramarathon or run a park run or swim a lap of the lake or cycle up a mountain. The preparation is in the training you do. It's building muscle memory. And whether that be interval training, hill repeats, watt bike sessions, weight sessions, that's what we're doing. Training for response, building muscle memory. In pandemic preparedness, we have to train for how to respond and then respond in the way that we have trained. And also, when it comes to disease X, this unknown threat, we have to be unfazed by the idea that we don't know much about it. We have to be brave enough to know that we can do a lot even though we don't know what this thing is. We have to accept that we don't know much about it, and we still come out with confidence and the resilience and the training and the muscle memory so that we can tackle it more effectively. Crucially, we have to approach emerging novel viral threats with the knowledge of both the knowns and the unknowns. It's not all unknown. We don't know the next disease X's name, but we do know it's out there, biding its time. We don't know where it will emerge, but we do know that it definitely will. We don't know whether it will come from an animal, a bird, but we do know what types of animals and birds, or bats actually, that have been involved in previous spillover events. We know the ones to look out for. We don't know what the next disease X virus looks like in its structure, but we do know that it's likely to come from one of a finite number of families, of viral families. And we do know what many of those families' members, the viral family members, look like and what they can do. So I wanted just to pause here and bring us a little bit up to today's headlines with the hantavirus outbreak on the cruise ship. I'm sure you've seen there's a recent outbreak, a cluster of infections and sadly 3 deaths. I haven't read the latest, but I think that's the way the epidemiology is at the moment. But this hantavirus, it's an outbreak of Andes virus, which belongs to the hantavirus family. It doesn't appear to be a global threat, but it is a good reminder that disease risks are ever present and growing, and that preparedness is essential. It reminds us of some of the important truths that are easy to push to the back of your mind if you're doing that business of seeking to move on and put all this nasty stuff behind us. Zoonotic spillovers from animals to humans can spark disease outbreaks caused by both known and novel viruses, anywhere and at any time. The conditions that make those spillovers more likely are not going away, they're getting worse. Climate change reshapes ecosystems and animal behaviour. International travel means local events become international events pretty quickly. Conflict and displacement of people push populations into new environments where health services can be strained or exposure risks are different. All of these pressures are increasing the risk. And even when a pathogen is not remotely comparable to a highly transmissible respiratory virus like COVID or measles, for example, a situation can still attract high concern if it involves what feels like a perfect storm of circumstances. A confined setting, like a cruise ship. And obviously the cruise ship that was, I think it was called the Princess Diamond or Diamond Princess at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. It's so evocative of those early days. we have international passengers, a sudden cluster of cases that raises questions not only about the pathogen, but about whether we're seeing something routine, something normal, or something unusual and something new. And this is exactly how the earliest days of many outbreaks feel. They're messy, they're ambiguous, they're unsettling. The world doesn't get a clear label. This is an outbreak, this is an epidemic, this is a pandemic. It doesn't even get a label of what the disease is. It doesn't get this stuff immediately. We don't have certainty. This will be small, this will be catastrophic. And we have to be able to make decisions amid all that uncertainty. And in some ways, the most important point about the hantavirus situation is that it reinforces that infectious disease threats can emerge anywhere and spread internationally very quickly through travel, which is why preparedness is not just a slogan, it's a practical discipline, and it has to happen. Preparedness means we build capabilities before we need them. It means we understand the high-risk viral families in advance so that diagnostics and vaccines and countermeasures like vaccines can be developed more quickly when the outbreaks do crop up. And it means doing the scientific groundwork now so that when new viruses strike, the world is one step ahead in responding and not always chasing the virus. And this is the whole logic of CEPI's preparedness work. And it's not theoretical, it's actually being done. The headline here really is not that there is an outbreak of a scary disease, it's that, and it's not that every new outbreak is a cluster of infections is definitely the next pandemic threat. The headline is that the world is being served another reminder, stark, important reminder, that the next serious threat could come from many different directions. And the only sensible response is to do the groundwork across the viral families before crisis erupts. So with that in mind, I just wanted to come back to the structure of my book. I seem to have gone all over the place with the slides, sorry. And why I structured it this way, I don't know. Some of you may have read it, some of you may not. I hope that some of you will. I think the structure of it is important because it says a lot about what I was trying to achieve in writing it and in publishing it, and CEPI publishing it, or I published it with CEPI's blessing, and why I'm going around talking about it. The subheading, the 100 Days Mission to End Pandemics, is about the 100 Days Mission. But the book has 9 chapters, and only one of those 9, the last one, is actually about executing the 100 Days Mission. And actually that chapter is the only fictional part of the book. It's the bit where I got to make stuff up, which was fun. The other 8 chapters are a series of rallying calls or warnings, if you like, for what we and the world, CEPI and the world, need to do to get ourselves into a state of readiness for this 100 Days Mission. I describe it as getting mission ready to help and to show how we can do that. I've named each chapter under a prepare to title. So we need to prepare to be scared, prepare to move fast, prepare to take risks, prepare to spend money, prepare to listen, prepare to fail, and so on. And the reason I structured it like that is because I wanted to focus the vast majority of the attention on the preparedness aspect of this, of what CEPI does and what the world needs to do to be able to prevent the next pandemic. I also wanted to elevate people's thinking about preparedness, to see it as something that is dynamic and active and ongoing. It's not something passive and boring and dry and mundane, but something alive and exciting and ultimately rewarding. It's about being response ready. And we need to cover a lot of bases in preparedness. One of the most important of those is surveillance. Given the unknown heritage of a future disease X, we need to keep our eyes peeled at all times. In other words, we need to monitor zoonotic spillover events. Vigilance is one of our first lines of defence. The hantavirus example is exactly that, a reminder that spillover is not a one-off historical event. It's an ongoing biological reality. It can be a known virus in a new setting. It can be a known virus behaving in an unusual or unfamiliar way. It can be a known viral family that has thrown up a novel virus. The task of surveillance is not only to notice that people are getting sick, but to notice the patterns early and to track them, to link cases quickly and to ask the right questions clearly and quickly. And it's also not only about identifying only the next COVID, it's about recognising that any outbreak can become a stress test of readiness. How quickly do we detect it, characterise it, sequence it, share the data, share the information, communicate uncertainty, and how quickly do we respond and how effectively? Another vital component, of course, is getting that swift and accurate sequencing of a new pathogen and, crucially, sharing it as widely and as quickly as possible. Knowledge is power. And in those first few days where we have so little knowledge, and in a world where we're facing the unknown threats, those first few bits of knowledge about the pathogen, those are the bits that hold the key to developing diagnostics and possible treatments and vaccines. And those are the things that could give us the power to contain it before it runs out of control. And of course, we saw during COVID that transparency and early global collaboration are absolutely essential. Disease surveillance is not a national affair. It's a global responsibility. Viruses do not stop at borders. And if we do, then the next disease X virus will overcome us. Another critical factor is for the world to be able to make new vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics against viruses in every part of the world, in every region. Precisely because we don't know where the next threat will emerge. The vulnerability of supply chains during COVID-19 exposed how extremely dependent the world was on just a very few vaccine manufacturers, maybe 5 or 6, in a very few, mainly rich world countries and regions. And that meant that some regions and some countries had very limited access to vaccines and were very much at the end of the queue. And many had no homemade vaccines, so no locally made vaccines at all. So part of the strategy in preparedness must be to diversify the manufacturing and production of countermeasures like vaccines and treatments and diagnostic, and to invest now in the types of technology that will work for all countries. Countries that don't have super cold chain storage facilities, for example. So we need to develop vaccines that are heat stable, that are possibly, intranasal, those kinds of technologies that can be used in multiple settings. And here too, we must share, just like with the surveillance and the data. Technology transfer of production capabilities is crucial to empowering lower and middle income countries to produce their own vaccines. Disease X doesn't wait for geopolitical negotiations. And remember, local defences, national defences or regional defences could, and in fact can, really stop an epidemic becoming a global pandemic. There's also, of course, a need for speed. And one of the chapters in my book is prepare to move fast. We need to pick up the pace, even when we're racing against unknown threats. We did this during COVID to a certain extent. And of course, COVID was an unknown threat. And one of the most important lessons I think we learned is that being ready to act at speed with the right technology and know-how and resources can give the world this crucial head start against a new viral threat. And with COVID, many countries and regions were way behind the curve, way behind the line on a lot of pandemic preparedness measures. But on one key front, actually, in the race against this particular viral threat, but the front of vaccine development, the world had put itself a few steps ahead, almost by accident, maybe by design. And that's because scientists, some of them actually funded by CEPI and the UK government, had been spending several years working on coronaviruses. So first on the original SARS virus, and then on the MERS virus that emerged about a decade after the original SARS and was infecting people in the Middle East. And it was largely that kind of detective work that meant that in 2020, scientists did actually know quite a lot about coronaviruses, even though we'd never seen this particular one before. It was thanks to that decade of work that some of the critical features of this family were actually quite familiar. Scientists had already figured out the structure of some of the signature proteins, for example, proteins that were common across several viral family members, including, for example, the spike protein that many of you may well have heard of. That became an extremely useful target for vaccines, and drug developers were able to create and develop new candidate vaccines really quite quickly, record speed, because that previous detective work had been done. Effectively, what happened was they pulled off the shelf data and knowledge on SARS and MERS, virology, vaccinology, immunology, and they tweaked it to figure out how best to tackle the novel coronavirus. So despite having never before seen it, they didn't have to start from scratch in developing vaccines to defend against it. That gave humanity a head start. And that's where CEPI's viral family approach comes in. So if I can find the right slide, yeah. This is where taking an approach, a scientific approach that looks across viral families is very important. It's work that will create and build that repository of knowledge and data and vaccine platform technology, components, and immunology and so on that can be mined at high speed when a novel virus emerges. Because getting ahead of any viral threat, all viral threats, known and unknown, is just an impossible task, right? I mean, there are 25 or so viral families that scientists think are the ones that are most likely and have shown the ability to produce viruses that infect humans. But there are already 300 or so known viruses within those families, and we can't make vaccine candidates against 300 of those viruses, just in case. But the beauty of the viral family approach is that we don't need to. Because those 300 or so several viruses come from these 25 viral families, so it's a finite amount of work. It's a large amount of work, but it is a finite amount of work, which means it's doable. We can take a prototype vaccine approach to preparing defenses against them. We gather the knowledge, the scientific insight, the research data, on a selection of representative viruses from each of those families, and we create prototype vaccines that target their most common threatening features. That way, we have a bank of detailed fundamental knowledge on just about anything that those viral families can throw up. So again, the hantavirus situation is it's a useful case study. When you hear of a hantavirus outbreak, I don't know whether many of you would have been hearing that word for the first time, possibly. Some of you. You might have heard of it as a disease that is quite rare, very much associated with particular regions or particular contexts, so rodent spread. You may have known that it can cause severe and deadly disease. You may not have known that. You might think it could be pandemic level serious, or you might think that the media are just overreacting, or the WHO is overplaying it, or maybe underplaying it. You may have all sorts of worries and suspicions about the virus, about its potential, and about health authorities' abilities to deal with it. But what's important, in my view, is that this should not be about thinking every viral outbreak is a global catastrophe. It's about recognizing that the world's vulnerability does not just sit with viruses that are already highly transmissible in people. Our vulnerability sits with the speed of travel, the fragility of health systems under pressure, the way misinformation spreads faster than any pathogen. I mean, seriously, any pathogen. It's extraordinary. I don't know if you've seen in the last 24 hours memes already being produced that Bill Gates created hantavirus and predicted that he was going to unleash it on the world in 2026. I mean, extraordinary how quickly these things are created. Our vulnerability sits with the reality that early outbreak response is always a race against time and a situation where we're dealing with high levels of uncertainty. So even if the hantavirus outbreak is limited, it still does two very important things. It exposes gaps and it can prove readiness or not. Because in the early hours and days of an outbreak, before anything is confirmed, the critical questions are always the same. Did we detect it early enough? Did we characterize it accurately? Did we share the information fast enough for others to learn about it? Do we have diagnostics that we can deploy quickly? Do we have standards, assays that we can deploy? Do we have medical countermeasures, treatments, vaccines? And if we don't, how quickly can we develop them? What do we need to do to be able to do that? Who's done the scientific groundwork to make that possible? Family-based preparedness is essentially the decision to stop treating each virus as a separate surprise and start treating viral families as a set of related problems that the groundwork can be done on in advance, and it is then a finite amount of work. So, I mean, in the case, I just wanted to throw in that in the case of the hantavirus outbreak, the groundwork there really it's the same with any family, but you want to have designed antigens, so the proteins that produce an immune response. And, the good news is there are some designed antigens against Andes virus. Some of those have been tested in mouse models and other animal models, and they do produce an immune response. So that's a tiny step forward. We need assays and standards to allow developers then to measure, and so that we have a common standard by which people can, scientists can compare the immune response of vaccines that they're developing. And we need networks of partners, all of which CEPI has in. We work with networks of people, and the idea is that we get them mobilized quickly and we connect them all so that these bits of science that have been done all over the place can be brought together. And so I suppose all of that, I just want to give the impression there that epidemic and pandemic preparedness that's what it's about. It's very active, it's very ongoing, it's not something that is like a dusty old plan that we have a preparedness plan and you stick it on a shelf and then you sit and wait for something to happen. It is a living set of ready to go scientific building blocks. And that makes a difference in a crisis, because every day saved at the start of an outbreak is a day in which fewer people are exposed, fewer cases are misdiagnosed, fewer healthcare workers are put at risk, and fewer rumours fill the vacuum. Preparedness is speed, but it's also confidence. It's the ability to say, we don't fully understand what is happening yet, but we are not starting from scratch. We are not improvising. We have trained. We have muscle memory. One other reason that I think the hantavirus example is useful is that it shows how quickly public attention and anxiety and misinformation can spike, even when the scientific risk assessment is cautious. When there's an unusual cluster of cases, particularly in a confined setting with international passengers, it can generate headlines and speculation, and that is understandable. And it underlines a crucial part of preparedness that we don't always talk about enough, which is risk communication. Preparedness isn't just about laboratories and vaccines and supply chains and scientists and immunologists. It's also about trust. It's the ability to explain clearly what we know, and just as clearly, if not more so, what we don't know yet, what we're doing to find out, and what people should do right now. That is hard, it's delicate, and if we mishandle it, we worsen outcomes. People may overreact, people may underreact, and they may distrust the authorities, or they may turn to misinformation. So when I say preparedness is dynamic and active and ongoing, I mean all of it, all of preparedness: surveillance, sequencing, data sharing, countermeasure, R&D, manufacturing readiness, technology transfer, and communication that is honest and calm and quick. Because the next disease X doesn't just test our science, it will test our societies. So in the book's drumbeat of chapters, I write that we should prepare to be scared, prepare to move fast, prepare to share, prepare to fail, prepare to take risks, prepare to spend money. I hope that you'll read it, and I hope that you will see in it a potential roadmap towards a pandemic-free world, a way to build a free future in which the next viral pathogen to pose a pandemic threat is controlled and neutralised before it can unleash its worst. That is the 100 Days mission, and it is both a local mission and a global one. Cooperation is vital when humanity is facing threats that respect no borders. The reality of our international interconnectedness and our global interdependency is at the same time that it is one of our greatest vulnerabilities to viral threats and one of our greatest defences against them. Local surveillance and global surveillance, early detection and early action, data sharing and coordinated containment efforts are all the way that we will get ahead. The 100 Days mission itself is not a countdown or a race, it's a call to action. It's a call to prepare for this realistic, absolutely achievable mission to be able to develop countermeasures within 100 days of a newly emerging threat. And it's an expression of hopeful confidence that the world can come together in a mission that will enable humanity to stop the next disease X before it runs out of control. I think it's a global and equitable and ultimately successful way to think about how to prepare for disease X threats. I hope that you'll agree, and I hope you'll see how vital your work is in the future to help getting us mission ready. I'd like to end my talk by just returning to something simple but important. When I wrote Disease X, I did it in the shadow of COVID. But the book isn't only about COVID. It's about the constant stream of repeated novel outbreaks and what that stream of repeated outbreaks is trying to teach us and what we can and should learn from it. One of the things it is trying to teach us is that outbreaks that do not become global crises are not something to be ignored. They are warnings, they are tests, and in some cases, they are epidemics or even pandemics thwarted. The last chapter of this book is called A Pandemic is Thwarted. There should be moments when we can look honestly at ourselves and ask, did we see it quickly enough? Did we share quickly enough? Did we have the tools? Did we have the groundwork? Did we have the networks? Did we have the sense and the discipline to respond effectively without panic and also without delay? The hantavirus outbreak is not likely to become a global crisis, thankfully, but it should not be dismissed. It should not be viewed as a cry wolf situation either. If it helps us to refocus and analyse how ready we are, if it helps us to strengthen surveillance, sharpen communication, build laboratory capacity and keep investing in research and vaccine prototype work across multiple viral families, then it will help us be a few more steps ahead the next time. Because the moment we stop investing in preparedness is the moment we accept that the next pandemic will erupt on a world that is still unprepared. The moment we accept that we will be caught unaware once more. And we have lived through what that looks like. It was devastating. So yes, of course, we all need to move on from COVID. And I don't think people should be living with constant anxiety and fear of every infectious disease event. But I do think we should move on with our eyes open, with muscle memory, with the scientific groundwork being laid, being refined, being built on, being updated, so that the next time an unknown virus emerges, whether from a coronavirus family, an influenza virus, a paramyxovirus, an orthopox virus, or something we haven't met before, or a member of a family like hantaviruses that suddenly behaves in a way that challenges our assumptions. So when that thing emerges, we can say we are ready to move fast. We are ready to take risks. We are ready to share. We are ready to spend money smartly and quickly. We are ready to fail and we are ready to learn. And we are ready to act in the way that we train to, because pandemics are not inevitable. Outbreaks are inevitable, but pandemics are a choice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing all this stuff, thoughts and this conversation with all of us. Now we will have some time for some of your questions.
Yes, I'll come and sit down now.
So do we have questions
Can't
online?
get a pen though.
Yeah, that's one question on the chat.
Fantastic. Do you please feel free just to raise your hand if you have any question, please. Let's set some items. Perhaps we can take a couple of questions here, then a couple of questions later.
Absolutely.
We would like to take one question at a time, or perhaps a couple of questions. So just
See how it goes with one at a time.
one at a time. That would be fantastic. I'm sorry for the interruption. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm a student studying public health right now, and I was just kind of curious, since you've mentioned, there are an approximate of 25 viral families, as well as, from which we have our 300 plus non-viruses.
Mhm.
But, with the current changing, global trends and how the world is changing, how likely or unlikely is the discovery or the emergence of a new viral family, which shares completely zero properties with any of these other families?
Very good question. I think it's highly unlikely. One caveat to that would be the prospect of AI-enabled viruses, which I'm don't know enough to be able to say that, and I think that is a future potential that hopefully we would mitigate against before it becomes a reality. The 25 or so viral families that have been, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of viruses in those viral families already that we know about. I think the way that those 20, I mean, 25 does sound like a small number. It's not a small number because there are hundreds of viruses in those families. And those are the families that have already produced viruses that can spread to humans. They don't all do that all the time, and many of them would have, you know, one-off spillover events and so on, but they have the potential, and they have the potential then to, you know, mix in and mutate and so on. But I think that covering those 25 bases, which is not, it is a finite amount of work, but it is an enormous amount of work. But I think that would put us a long way ahead, in terms of if we could confidently play whack-a-mole with anything that came from any of those viral families, we'd be in a lot better position than we are now. So, having said all of that, I'm not a scientist, so.
Of course. Yes, please.
So Helen on the Zoom has asked if you could talk a bit about supportive staff and whether valuing and rewarding and protecting frontline staff fits in with your resilience principles. And she mentioned how something that comes to mind, this comes to mind because it feels like a known factor that was somewhat ignored in COVID-19. For example, the fact that student nurses were promoted to the front line and yet they were still expected to pay their university fees.
Feels a little bit out of my remit, that question. I'm not a politician, but I mean, protecting frontline health workers is one of the first priorities in an outbreak, and always should be. And you know, you're seeing with the outbreak at the moment that, you know, the full PPE and so on is being used. And if CEPI is ever involved in an outbreak response where we're using a candidate vaccine. For example, in Rwanda, there was a Marburg outbreak in late 24, and we began a clinical trial to test a vaccine. It was deployed within frontline healthcare workers first. That was on the decision of the Rwandan government, but yeah, I mean, I do think that most governments would see, and certainly the WHO guidance is that frontline healthcare workers should be protected before or along with as as the first people to get protection. Yeah.
Thank you. Wes, so
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a student of development management, and this is a little bit about the intersection of multiple social concerns that arose from the pandemic in specific. My dissertation topic is actually related to COVID-19, so today has been particularly useful for me in that sense. There's a huge talk about equity, about pandemic preparedness, and my interests are in informal and unorganized labor sectors in India, where a lot of reverse migration occurred when the pandemic had occurred. 80% of the population there is actually in the informal sector. So, in the 100 Days mission, for example, do you address informal workers or precarious labor in low and middle income countries? Can vaccine equity and labor system accommodate upcoming pandemics in that sense? Because that is one area where preparedness even today seems much lower. So,
Yeah, I mean that's the 100 Days mission does have equity at its heart. And one of the things that that I talked about with in the sort of global sense of preparedness is that having these regional capabilities, so not having the entire world dependent on 3 or 4 global pharma companies to make vaccines for the entire world in the event of a pandemic, and then decide to sell them to the highest bidders and leave people behind. That system it cannot work. Obviously, it leaves many people, millions of people unprotected. It also prolongs a pandemic, because the more concentrated the protection is and the more exposed some countries are, then there's a good argument to be made, or a solid argument to be made, that the Delta wave of COVID could possibly have been stopped if there had been more equity of distribution of the first wave of vaccines, but in terms of the sort of detail of getting down into parts of individual, sections of individual national populations and how they access vaccines, that's not something that we've kind of written policy for or anything else. But the principle of having vaccine manufacturers in lower and middle income countries that use the technology, have had technology transferred, mRNA technology or whatever, ahead of time. So again, they're not starting from scratch trying to make mRNA vaccines or rapid response vaccine platforms, but they've got that kind of capability and that muscle memory within the pharma sector of various countries in lower and middle income settings is incredibly important. And as I say, it's not just about kind of being the morally the right thing to do. It's actually about containing an epidemic. The next epidemic or pandemic threat might emerge anywhere. It could be in the US, it could be in Bangladesh, it could be in Rwanda, it could be anywhere. And the closer you can build countermeasures, develop countermeasures and deploy them to the closer to the epicenter you can get them done, the fewer you need in the end anyway, because if you can contain a pandemic, contain an epidemic, either in a nation or a region, then so equity does actually shorten an epidemic as well. But in terms of sections of the population, that's a level of detail that's that's not really in that plan.
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks so much for your presentation and congratulations on your book.
Thank
It's good to sort of see the impact that that's already having we can hear in this room in terms of moving the conversation forward. I will ask you a journalist question because maybe you feel like we can get a bit more out of that. What role in the sort of world of AI, you know, we've got lots of misinformation that you spoke about, but also disinformation. It's almost becoming its own sector of how much disinformation can we create to sort of stir confusion and angst within populations. When it comes to basic health belief model, for example, we know that people think very differently about health depending on their environment and their experiences. What role do you feel that journalism, print or media, has in ethically considering the impact that has on the way that people make decisions before, during, and after pandemics? So as a journalist, what is the ethical responsibility that we can try and push in our work and our narratives and the work we do to remind journalism the important role that they play in how people respond to these things?
Yeah. So the role that a journalist has in any of that in that situation is to speak the truth and to put that truth in context, so that it is not, so that it is well understood, if you see what I mean. So I think that during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of noise around vaccine hesitancy and vaccine rejection and so on. But one of the things that I found comforting, I suppose, was that when it came down to it, when vaccines were being produced, the vast majority of people could not wait to get them. They were queuing round the corners and demanding them. And you know, you've seen in the recent outbreak of in Coventry, no,
Canterbury.
it's Canterbury. Sorry, yeah, and so I think it's incredibly important to remember that, you know, when we were faced with a disease that was killing people and that was spreading incredibly fast, the vast majority of people faced with all the information, you know, and misinformation, came to the decision that they wanted to have the vaccine and they wanted to wear a mask and they wanted to not visit their aging grandparents and put them at risk. So most people in that situation make a decision that they believe correctly will protect their family and themselves and their loved ones from infection. And the best that journalists can do is reflect what's actually happening, but reflect. So, you know, well, you know, obviously there's the reporting on the vaccine development and how that's going and everything else, but there's also the reporting on the society's reaction, and you can't ignore that there is vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax movements and anti-mask movements and anti-lockdown movements and stuff. So those all become stories in themselves. But as long as you keep all of that in the context, you know, that anti-vax movements are vocal, but actually quite a small proportion of people. So, I mean, there's no doubt that journalists have responsibilities. My experience is that science journalists are pretty responsible and they're pretty keen on keeping to the facts. And I think that the best you can do is stick with the facts and lay them out calmly and well contextualized.
Heather on the chat wanted to know if you have any comments on the news today that the cruise ship passengers have not been able to disembark today in France because of the norovirus outbreak, which included one death. Do you think this is an overreaction or a legitimate response in light of the outbreak last week?
Didn't know about this, I'm afraid, because I've been driving. Is there another cruise ship with a norovirus outbreak?
I'm not sure. She doesn't specify. She just said.
I believe it's Noro.
Yeah, she said yes.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I don't know about that. Norovirus is a nasty disease, and it is a viral disease, and there is a vaccine in development for it, as far as I know. But it's not a pandemic threat at all. But I wouldn't be able to comment on that, I'm afraid, sorry.
Thank you so much. Do we have any? Please.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Tekla. I'm a lecturer at the Global Development Institute. I really like your book and the ideas that you're sort of like putting up for us today. And you used like we in the whole conversation, and I was wondering who the we is, if it involves people like me, ordinary people, or but I also wondered if like where the place of politics is it, where the place of politics is in the context you're talking about, especially given the fact that we have a quite like dramatic shift in global politics in terms of like the funding allocation, in terms of like all that. I wondered like where you see the politicians in that conversation.
Yeah, I think first of all, absolutely, it does. It is a we that includes all of us. We're all citizens of nations where we have a vote and can influence, our close communities' behaviour, but also our governments and so on as well. And yes, I mean, you're right. The global geopolitical scene is difficult at the moment, and funding for science, in particular, has been falling off a cliff in some parts, and the US government's research budgets have been cut dramatically, but also the funding for development and so on, and CEPI sits quite across quite a lot of those spaces, and the way that I see it really is that this is epidemic and pandemic threats are a security issue. If you think about, I know that the world is a difficult place at the moment. There is conflict. There's multiple conflicts. There are humanitarian disasters and everything else. In the last 7 years, the thing that brought the world totally to its knees, the whole world totally to its knees, was a virus, a tiny, tiny, tiny virus. It shut down the entire world. And so I think we as a global community have to view epidemic and pandemic preparedness on a par with, or in the same space as defense, security. And we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on national defense, and to be able to build pandemic readiness and pandemic defenses that would put us a long way ahead of the next viral threat would cost a fraction of that. And so, you know, I do recognise that the funding situation, global health development aid funding situation is not good, but it's you know, we need to shift the mindset, because this is a security problem. It's not aid, it's not development, it's global health security. And also we have to recognize that, you know, if the US, you know, one of the big funders of science and aid is pulling back, you know, that doesn't leave the rest of the world unable to do anything. You know, cooperation, global collaboration is immensely powerful if it's coordinated, and you know, we can step in and close that gap, or make up that gap with well coordinated scientific cooperation and kind of sharing of resources and sharing of technology and knowledge and so on. We can go a long way.
Perhaps we have the time for one last question, like. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. I have actually two questions, but we can respond them together. So the first is, so I'm a historian of medicine, and I maybe come to this from a somewhat different angle, but I understand that our positions here might differ, but I'm interested in how you yourself, in writing this book and advocating it, conceptualize this extreme difference between viruses and epidemics and pandemics, the difference in scale, when you, for instance, have to counter this argument that it's only once in a lifetime event, because there is a huge difference between a disease that causes you know, many millions of deaths and a disease which causes 3 deaths so far, or even, you know, Ebola, which causes thousands of deaths. So it's not completely legitimate to question lumping them in the same category by your potential opponent. So I think you must have come up with some ways to counter it. So I would be interested in hearing that. And the second question is also, it actually very well connects to the previous one. I was also wondering about the we in your conversation. It's really striking how you speak with this renown. But from a somewhat different angle. So when one uses your example of hantavirus, of course, one has to think also that it's very much a disease of the privileged. There's people on a cruise ship there. There's mostly people coming from the Western countries. So, and an outbreak, you know, in some village in Central Asia, which could have more cases, would never receive such media attention before it is maybe too late, before it has reached a very different scale. So, and how, when we think about the we, how do we incorporate these very different we's that we have in our planet, including the regions with which we are not necessarily in conversation, including, you know, countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Russia at the moment. So type of polities where we do not necessarily understand the scientific cultures, where people might have very different ideas of what disease is, have different conceptions of scientific expertise, of public health, death even, and its values. So how does that all come together in this big collective?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that I absolutely agree with this idea that, you know, to me, you know, what I said previously about the biggest global event in my mind that has happened was the COVID pandemic in the last 7 or 8 years. But I suppose I don't accept, but I do think a lot of people don't see it like that. You see what I mean? They have already forgotten, they have already put it behind us. They've sort of re-rationalized it, or I mean, even people say, well, that was mostly old people that died and they were going to die anyway, or so I mean, obviously people will have a different perspective, and I absolutely agree that there are different levels of outbreak, but when we're talking about pandemic threats, what we're talking about really is highly transmissible respiratory viruses, right? Flu, bird flu, coronaviruses, some kind of paramyxovirus, which measles is one of those. It's highly transmissible, not very deadly, but you can see how a paramyxovirus could attain the qualities to be very deadly, But I think I don't agree that the smaller outbreaks are not worthy of our attention. I don't know whether that's what you were saying, but I mean, I think they are, partly because they do kill people, and partly because they can help us prepare for the larger ones. We can learn a lot about the viruses that cause these outbreaks and how to and the features. We can do the viral family work. So obviously I'm biased because I write about viruses. I work for an organization that is trying to prevent and mitigate against pandemic threats. So but I do think that the threat of pandemics is one of, it is a big thing, and I do think it's something that we should all think about. And because the bang for your buck, I suppose, the amount of investment, financial investment that it would take to be in a much better place is so marginally. It's such a small fraction of what we spend on defending in security and other spheres that it just feels to me like a no-brainer. And in terms of the I mean, I've now had two people asking me about. I might have to think about whether I use we quite so often. But I suppose it's partly we, as in CEPI, the organisation I work for, but I also think it is a we in terms of, our societies and the societies that were affected and lived through and saw the devastation of COVID-19 and would like to be able to do something to avoid that happening again, I suppose is what I mean by we.
Well, Kate, thank you one more time for the time. I think this is a really good example of the things that we should be thinking in advance to the next pandemic that we know we will follow. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all, everybody online. We want to invite you to continue this conversation informally in the comments. So at the entrance of the building, if you would like to join us, we will have some snacks and some drinks to continue this conversation informally, and also to